Yeah, I'm happy with it. Now let's build it. Today I'll be showing you how to create a tree with lichens, moss growing up the trunk which blends into the terrain, and most importantly, how to get away with not needing an ugly base. I like to use these tree armatures from Woodland Scenics. They are bendable, which makes it really fun and easy to get into the position that you want. This tree is pretty big, so I'll be using a lot of these, and since they aren't big enough by themselves, I use sticks as the trunk. I glue to the base that comes with the armatures just because it's a nice hard platform. A lot of times I will just use one stick for the trunk and that is sufficient to make it look good, but with a tree this size I thought it looked more realistic to have a split halfway up. So I added another stick to the side. Whenever you are gluing onto sticks, make sure you cut into it at least enough to where you are not gluing onto the bark, because the bark will peel off and your tree will lose a branch really easy. Now for the armatures. These have a bunch of molding lines and nubs, so be sure to cut those off. You want a really strong bond here because once the tree is done, if a branch breaks off, it's really annoying to put it back on, because then you have to re-glue it, but then you still see the line where it broke, so then when you have to repaint it and try to match the paint from before, and if it's been a while you won't remember what paint you used, and sometimes you even have to fill in a gap where it broke. So just glue it good the first time. But since glue dries slow if you have a lot of it, I just use a little bit, just enough to get the branch to dry quickly and hold itself there, and then go back and fill in the gaps with a lot of glue, because then you won't have to sit there holding the branch while it's drying. It is a lot easier to paint these armatures before you bend them, but with bigger trees like this where you have multiple different armatures, it's a lot easier to tell where the next branch should go if the armatures that are already glued on are in the shape that you want them to be. Now I use the Dremel to sand down the areas where the stick meets the armature so that it's a seamless transition between the two. Now I use Sculpt-to-Mold to get the shape of the trunk. All you do is get it wet and then you can start molding. It's easiest to start at the base and work your way up. It gets pretty messy, so have a couple paper towels nearby. The goal is to have it flare out a little bit at the bottom and also form the part of the tree that becomes the branch. It can be pretty rough because we will do all the finishing touches with a Dremel once it's completely dry. As this is drying, you can come back and smooth out some areas and mold it more. It works best to have a bowl of water to dip your fingers in as you mold because it doesn't stick to your fingers as much when they're damp. I messed this up because I waited too long to come back and mold as it was drying, so it was just too hard to mold it. But that just meant that I had to do more sanding. Give it overnight to dry before you do the Dremel work. I sand over an open hardwood floor because it is easy to sweep up the mess. Use the roughest sander attachment you have because that will save you time and also create a bark-like texture. Take your time here though and constantly be turning the tree to make sure you're not taking too much off. Use the sander to get the tree in the desired shape and then switch to this little ball attachment to get all the small details like the root flares at the base of the tree. I also like to etch in some details like bigger bark lines here and there to make it look more real. Most importantly, I put magnets on the bases of all of my trees. All you need to do is drill a hole in the base, make it a little bit square, and then glue the magnet in. In order to be sure that the magnet gets glued flat to the bottom, I put a piece of paper over a flat piece of metal. The base of my light works great, and then glue it down on top of that. You might be wondering what the point of this is. Well, all of my terrain has sheet metal with Woodland Scenic's blended turf earth blend over the top. It is extremely useful to be able to magnet things to your terrain, and I highly recommend trying it out. This is what allows me to be able to go without having a big base under my trees. I am very picky about how my terrain looks, and I have always hated seeing the line that tree bases cause. This tree is very well done and it looks awesome, but no matter what you do, you can still see a line where the base meets the ground. Also, the bases can get in the way of your miniatures moving underneath the trees. I thought of this solution for all of that a long time ago, and I have absolutely loved being able to magnet things to my terrain. Now for the painting. First thing I do for this kind of tree is cover it completely in Folk Art Real Brown. Then dry brush Folk Art Steel Gray. A bigger and old brush that is already frayed works great for this. To prep the brush, just get a little bit of paint on the brush, then paint it on a napkin until you are barely painting any color. Then in large sweeping motions go over the entire thing. It goes on slow, but be patient, because if you try to go faster by leaving more paint on the brush, then you'll end up with a giant streak of gray across the tree and you'll have to start over with the brown. Now I dry brush a light tan skeleton bone color over the top to finish the bark. This is the first time I've ever tried adding lichens to a tree, and it turned out great. For this, I used a smaller old brush that is very frayed this time because you want to paint a lot of small dots at once. I used necrotic flesh for this, which was pretty close to a real lichen color. This is a weird technique, but the prep for this involves basically ruining your brush. I got the paint on the brush and then just jammed it straight down onto a napkin until I got it to look like this. Then I just dabbed it around the tree in random clusters until I was satisfied. Then I used army green the same way and dabbed it on top of the other clusters that I already painted to give it some color variation. Here I put some flocking on the base of the tree to make it look like moss is growing up the trunk. I start with Woodland Scenic's blended turf earth blend because that's what I use on my terrain, so it blends in nicely with that. And then as I go up, I switch to a fine turf burnt grass to make it look like more mossy green. I add little bits of this to where the lichen clusters are to make it look like some are sticking out of the tree a little bit, which really solidifies the appearance of lichen. And also a little bit to the crevices and tops of the branches where moss might be growing as well. And here's the fun part, adding the foliage. Don't use this spray adhesive because it didn't dry as a clear, so I had to paint over parts of it where it dried white. It was super annoying. Use any spray adhesive that says clear on it. Spray at an angle where you are spraying the ends of the branches but not getting much on the trunk. And then just push the foliage into position. I use Woodland Scenic's Bushes Light Green. Once you get some on the branches, you can spray right over the foliage you just put on and then push more on top of it. Keep building it up in this way until you're satisfied with the coverage. Here is a little trick I learned from Luke Towen on his Boulder Creek Railroad channel. Lightly spray adhesive over the top and then sprinkle a lighter green fine turf over it, which highlights just the top of the foliage as if the sun is shining down on the tree. It creates just a little bit more realistic contrast. Now the tree is complete, and here is a size comparison with a miniature next to it. I hope this video was helpful and that you learned some tips that you want to use on your next tree. And if you did, please hit those like, subscribe, and notification bell buttons and come back for my next video.